joining us, the two gentlemen, Mark Burley, who is the Executive Director for Downtown Kelowna. Prior to joining the DKA, Mark was the Group Program Director for Sun FM in the Okanagan Valley and at Easy Rock in Kelowna as well, and oversaw programming for all Bell Media stations in the BC interior. So actually, it was just funny how it worked out that Bell is sponsoring today, but we have a relationship with Bell. They've been pretty good with us. So Mark, it's great to have you with us, and we'll get into a further discussion with you in just a moment. Greg Wilson is Director of Government Relations for the Retail Council of Canada. Greg represents the interests of the retail industry with governments in BC. In addition, he serves on the board of two registered not-for-profit agencies, Encorp Pacific, which manages used beverage containers. That might be a subject unto itself, Greg, and the Major Appliance Recycling Roundtable. So first of all, I want to thank both of you for joining us in what should be an interesting hour. We'll cover as much as we can and provide as much information to those that have joined us. And just a reminder before I turn things over to Greg to introduce himself and the Retail Council and their work in light of COVID-19 and helping its members. I want to just make note that if you're new to Zoom, I suspect there's not many that are new to Zoom anymore, but we're going to use the Q&A function. So please use the Q&A function at any time. If you have a question or if you want to make a comment, you can do that as well using the chat function. That menu is at the bottom. As a reminder, we are recording, so please feel free to share the link and we'll share it with you afterwards and again follow up. So I'm going to turn things over at this stage to Greg to introduce yourself and we'll walk through your presentation. Thanks again, Greg, for joining us.
So thank you, Dan. And just as word of introduction to people who aren't familiar with what the Retail Council is, we're the trade association for Canadian retailers. So in British Columbia, there are 55,000 retail stores. We represent them. Sometimes, you have to be careful because we are a membership-based organization like Chambers of Commerce, but we represent the entire retail industry. And most of our resources, and one important one I'm going to talk about today, are available free to all retailers and in fact non-retailers through our website. So with that sort of brief, and we work from 7 offices across the country. So I have colleagues who are working with from our office in Winnipeg with the governments on the Prairie Province and from our Ottawa office with the federal government and likewise in Toronto, Montreal, and Halifax. So Retail Council, I mean, our industry has been dramatically impacted by COVID-19, perhaps not as much as hospitality and tourism, but more than many other industries. And so for context, at the end of February, there were about 310,000 British Columbians working in retail. By mid-April, that was down 70,000 in number. It appears to have come back another 20,000, so now we're net down about 50,000. But that means a lot of British Columbians working in retail have had job loss or what have you. We, for our members and for non-member retailers, worked with a large consulting entity called the Boston Consulting Group. They have offices around the world to create what we call a retail recovery playbook. It's in its 3rd edition. I realize that's a bit fast to be in a 3rd edition, but it started in March and it has been dramatically updated twice. There are 6 major sections dealing with operations and marketing and finance. I don't propose to go through them. I just note for anybody who's interested, it's a free download. I think you have to give your name and email address to get the download, but there's no commitment. And it's a very useful advice, contains very useful advice and learnings from around the world. I mean, when British Columbia began the plan to reopen retail in May, we didn't have a lot to look elsewhere in North America. And so, for example, on fashion and apparel, much of the advice came from Asian retail or European retail. And so Boston Consulting Group and Retail Council have done a good job of updating the guidebook, and we regularly feed in our the questions we're getting both on webinars and that we get one-on-one by email and phone call from retailers, so that we ensure that we cover as many of the relevant questions as possible. So retail sales were actually very strong in BC in February, and retail employment was very strong in BC in February, and then March happened. And so March is an anomaly, because March is a month where half of retail was open and half wasn't. But in the last couple of weeks of March and the first couple of weeks of April, the evidence is that that retail sales were about 25% of normal, and almost all of that was grocery and goods that would enable you to work at home. And since mid-May, most of the other retail has rebounded, and it seems to be continuing to rebound as customers gain more confidence. Mark obviously does a lot of work with restaurants. My hopeful view for restaurants is it's taken retail weeks to come back, but consumers are gaining confidence, so I'd be hopeful for the restaurant industry as well, and later for the hospitality industry as British Columbia moves into phase 3 with good luck next week. But those are sort of the parameters. I work, well, in addition to speaking to a lot of retailers and business groups, I work with other business groups like the BC Chamber of Commerce to advance business interests in Victoria. There's been a lot of regulation in the COVID-19 space, both from health authorities and from WorkSafe BC. So we've spent an awful lot of time working on the details of that advice and providing input to government. I'd have to say I'm still working on major things that I think could be improved in the advice from government, from both the health and WorkSafe folks. And so we're not giving up. And likewise, there's been some announcements on the wage subsidy piece today. My colleagues across the country are working on that fairly hard too. So I have 2 other slides besides the playbook. The one is about health guidance, and I essentially am offering this. It's less relevant today, but hopefully the Chamber will email these out or post them somewhere. The first is with health guidance. This is where the relevant health guidance is. Dr. Henry is a fan of voluntary compliance. So the main rule is to maintain a distance of 2 meters physical distance, but there are different rules for food businesses and for mall shops and stores, and so there are 2 links there. As I walk the street now that we're able to do that a bit more, I am consistently seeing themes of particular sort of behavior by retail stores in terms of how they manage their entrance and exit, so we could talk about that later. And so BC, the provincial health officer describes theirs as guidance, which is somehow stronger than recommendation. The WorkSafe BC guidance, they clearly mark theirs as recommendations. I note that if I have a concern about the WorkSafe BC recommendations, I find that their advice is better for large business and a little less relevant to small businesses whose spaces and stores are quite different in configuration and layout than large retail. So with that, I'll finish up, and I'm very happy to take questions and enjoy a good discussion.
You're muted, Dan.
I got to pay attention too. I was going to come to you, Mark, and just get your sense just off the top, and we'll come back to Greg in a moment, just to what you're hearing from your members, their phase 2 was announced, but it did take time for people to prepare. What's your sense that you're hearing from your members in downtown Kelowna? Are they making that switch? Are all of them doing that? Or some of them waiting to see? How's things going downtown?
I think that, thanks, Dan, first of all, for having me here today. And thanks to Chamber of Commerce for doing all this, and for Bell Media for supporting initiatives for businesses, particularly in downtown Kelowna, because that's my interest. But I'm hearing so many different things. Actually, the thing that surprised a lot of us was how quickly some businesses did reopen. And that was, for the most part, a lot of the businesses that reopened, even though they could have stayed open and chose to close, they had started online initiatives and stuff. And so they kind of had this, they were back in the swing of things, and the retail part of it, of actually opening the doors, was the next logical step in this new world that we've lived in. To Greg's point about how he's seen so different retailers offering different ways in managing their store traffic, that's very true. Some have gone to the expense of, floor printed physical distancing signs, to only allowing a certain number of people in the store at a time to achieve the physical distancing requirements. I think what the frustration, whether it's retail, restaurants, or service people who have businesses in downtown Kelowna, at the beginning of phase 2, was there was a lack of information from the BC government on what the requirements were. For example, for hairdressers and hair salons, that kind of thing. They had nothing until the Monday, whereas restaurants got stuff on the Friday. So now that all that information's out there, I think that there are a lot of retailers who are still struggling with understanding it. But like I said, we seem to have had a pretty good rate of reopening, and daily the business in downtown Kelowna is picking up. And by that, I mean the street traffic and the foot traffic, which gets addressed next month.
You bring up a good point, and I want to come to Greg with respect to the broader perspective in the long term, and the impact to the retail sector, in regards to something that Mark made, and I think we've all noticed, when people go home and they're not out, they're looking at other options and they're going online, and that doesn't necessarily bode well for local economies that want to see that money spent locally. Bricks and mortar, there's a bit of a back off. So I'm curious, Greg, from the Retail Council of Canada, and your perspective, what are you telling your members in how they deal? Is this likely to shift more people to that online, and then increase competition with American retail giants?
So that's obviously a concern for our members, and a concern for local communities, because those brick and mortar retailers, and they're occupying significant streetscape, and not only do they occupy a lot of real estate, they make those streetscapes interesting. And so that would be, in our view, a big loss for our communities across the country. There are things government can do, and frankly, we're a bit frustrated with government on this aspect, because there are advantages that those foreign entities have. They don't all uniformly collect and remit sales tax. They certainly don't charge eco fees and what have you. So they have advantages, and we wish that the province and the federal government would lessen those advantages that they have over our members and yours. But realistically, consumers are going to have to protect those businesses. We see a lot of initiatives in the local communities about currently shop local. I think it's probably never been more true that if you want to protect the local businesses, you really do have to patronize them. There's no other option to say than that. To businesses, the piece is a bit different. So online sales in Canada, the trend was that they essentially doubled at the beginning of the COVID crisis. But online sales in Canada were already quite a bit behind the US and a few other Asian jurisdictions. So it's not clear to us that that trend wasn't going to happen anyway. And so you know, my heroes, the folks who stayed open and done well throughout, the local businesses were the local businesses who tended to already have a strong online presence, and who really, even if they closed for the first 2 weeks or 3 weeks, they moved to a situation where people were either ordering and they were fulfilling that through mail or delivery options or through curbside pickup. So my sense is that that order and delivery piece will continue to climb. And look, sadly, a lot of retail businesses weren't already online, but happily, a lot of them have made strong efforts in the last couple of months to move online and transition their businesses. It's obviously harder for those who weren't online because they didn't have a good email list and so on and so forth. But I mean, you know, I have to be optimistic about the ability of local business to compete. We still have advantages over those big international ones, albeit not the price advantage.
And Mark, you can feel free to jump in if there are questions or comments you want to make as we have this discussion. We want to focus on providing as much information as we can to those that have joined us within the time frame that we have. And just a reminder, if folks have questions, use the Q&A button. It's great to have Greg with us as well as Mark. So we've got some pretty good resources for you to help you if you're on the retail side, or if you care about some of the long-term economic impacts that are going to result from this, and how we can potentially work together and collaboratively with the government and advocate for our joint members to create a better environment where the impact will be less than what it would be if we didn't work together and have the government responding. One of the questions that we do have, Greg, is for you. We're hearing this, and I suspect you are as well. So if you give them some thoughts around the concern that workers, you know, the labor force may not be there because they are getting federal support elsewhere. The impact to labor because of this, particularly on the retail side, and those, they may be part-time employees. Are you hearing from your members concerns around their labor force, short-term and long-term needs, and how that might play into the support programs that are available for government?
So this is, I don't know how to describe this in any other way than to say this is one of the most common questions we get and common comments we get. It started, frankly, with the grocers and general merchants who stayed open the entire time, who found that employees didn't want to come to work, and therefore were going on to what's called Serve the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, and not taking shifts and what have you. And it's been a bit hard in terms of labor management because, you know, it's harder to both justify and legally terminate that employee right now. So you're often holding a spot for somebody whose return is uncertain. We were heartened a bit when the government, federal government, said that they would make it clear that there were penalties for not following the rules on CERB. Truthfully, when we look ahead, we think that there will be a lot of tax implications for people who took CERB and don't understand that it's taxable income come next spring. And deductions, source deductions aren't taken off of CERB. But you know, it's hard to argue the national need for a benefit. We certainly support the benefit. Our greater concern right now is with the other program, with the wage subsidy program, as it's extended, that there's some sort of ramp to allow people to participate as their sales grow past the current limits.
You had talked in the introductory comments, Greg, about just particularly as an example, those in the fashion sector and industry. And then because you're part of a national network, there are different rules in every jurisdiction across the province. Have you seen their experience? And frankly, I think Mark flagged it too. It's one of the challenges because we're flooded with media, including from the US, and we're hearing all sorts of things, and we're not sure where we hear these. So there's, frustration among some because is this a rule? Is it a recommendation? Is it a requirement? Is it an order? How's BC shaping up from your perspective around this? And, a tangible example is, with someone that's in, the fashion or apparel, do they require specific cleaning, or are there just guidelines? Are there orders? So if you could comment on that, the provincial approach versus national on the retail side, and any guidance that you could give with understanding what are orders, guidelines, best practices kind of thing.
So if I have one really good thing to say about the province of British Columbia, and it was a bit tense right in the first couple of weeks, they passed an emergency order that limited the ability of municipalities and local authorities to make different rules. So in Ontario yesterday, there was a regional municipality who came up with new requirements for wearing masks and what have you that are different than the requirements elsewhere in Ontario. That's very hard, and in fact, in that particular region, those are really onerous for retail and businesses and restaurants. So that causes a lot of concerns, and then you have to go fight a fire with one regional district. So if there's something good in British Columbia, it's that. If there's a second good thing, it's that Dr. Henry has laid down the law that not every requirement is universal, and that there needs to be flexibility, that we're all trying to achieve physical distancing and take actions that will help alleviate any risks when people are closer than 2 meters apart. So fashion is a very interesting field because there's a lot that's done differently. And frankly, in 2 months, those best practices have changed more than in other, there was a very fast transition at the beginning in grocery. So there was huge transition in just a couple of weeks. With fashion, since reopening, that's been a little bit longer. But I think the most standard practice, frankly, now is a lot of emphasis on hand washing and hand sanitizing as people come into the business to alleviate concerns about touching garments and fitting garments and alteration of garments. With fittings and alterations, you see a lot of emphasis on wearing masks, but the most consistent sign I see at the entrance to businesses, or the most consistent request at the entrance to business, is still, please do not enter if you are ill or have symptoms of respiratory disease. And that is actually Dr. Henry's #1 request. So it seems that message has gotten out well.
One of the questions has arisen, and Mark, I'm curious whether you've had some of that, is, how much is transmitted on objects, right? And is there clarity? Are you hearing any concern in that regard from your members?
No.
The concern is there's no clarity. That really, there's a different message every day, and that is, is it asymptomatic or not? Does it live on surfaces or not? Because we hear different things, and that is actually, now that you bring it up, one of the larger comments that we get is, there's confusion on the transmission of COVID-19. And that's where, to speak to Greg's point about the fashion industry and the retail side, the big concern that I've heard from retailers who are selling clothes, particularly women's clothing stores, is if somebody tries something on, what do we do with it if they don't buy it? And that is the largest concern and comment I've heard. Greg,
can you pick that up?
So that's an interesting one. But in a way, I'm happy that the requirements aren't more prescriptive because the requirements could be very onerous. I think that's where the hand washing and hand sanitizing things goes in. I've seen increasingly with apparel retail that they have customers sanitize their hands at the entrance. Sometimes they make that fairly mandatory. And my understanding is that this helps employees feel, and the retailers themselves feel comfortable that if they've seen a customer sanitize their hands, they know that when they touch things, they're not transmitting germs. one of the interesting things about apparel, which is very different than other products, is that the surfaces are different. And so we don't know a lot about the transmission via touch yet. There's not a lot of scientific evidence. But our expectation is that when we have more evidence, we're going to find out that there's a lot of difference between the type of surfaces, how long something lasts on various surfaces. And what apparel retailers know is that there's a lot of difference between leather and cotton and wool, and so how long it's going to live on a natural versus synthetic fiber. Not a lot of science there. So that's why Dr. Henry is not able to provide a lot of good guidance there yet. And I think that stores are just trying to keep their customers and employees safe. And so this is why the trend seems to have moved from quarantining clothes into now asking people to sanitize hands.
You bring up an interesting point, Greg, because there's two parts of this. The one is the requirements of the business, and certainly paying attention to the health orders and requirements. I'm assuming, and I appreciate your comment, the WorkSafe BC guidelines are there to help, and whether that is good or bad. The second piece, which I think is also relevant, is consumer confidence. Now, there was an economist in the US that recently commented, it's not about the economy or health. In fact, if we pay attention to the health, the economy will help and recover quickly. So it's both combined. It's not one against the other. But consumer confidence is the unknown. So if you could comment on what requirements in British Columbia on the retail. Does it require a retail outlet to have hand sanitizers at the entrance, and is that information readily accessible of what is absolutely required? Then I think it's beyond that. It's kind of best practices to address the second issue, I'm assuming, of consumer confidence.
So there isn't a hard and fast requirement really in that regard. And truthfully, frankly, the draft documents I saw from WorkSafe weren't overly helpful. And in the end, retail is very different dependent on segment. And so what happens is the rules that were given are not really helpful for jewelry or for fashion and apparel, or frankly for furniture and appliance sales. The rules were just not, you'd need so many sets of rules or so many sets of guidance. We probably have more guidance in our retail recovery book than WorkSafe BC has. We describe ours as best practices. The confidence piece is the most critical. The confidence actually exists on three measures. We spoke about employees' confidence in returning to work. I think that is still an issue. There's retailers' confidence in reopening, or frankly, worry about their finances. And then the third piece is consumer confidence. Consumer confidence, though, by all measures, particularly in Western Canada, consumer confidence at going into retail stores has improved dramatically. So this morning, there's a news story about restaurants, that half of Canadians don't feel confident entering restaurants. I suspect that the number is better in Western Canada than in Ontario East. But that's an interesting comment, but it's at least double the nervousness, as it were, that customers have, or potential customers have, about retail stores. So I think people are getting more comfortable about going into retail stores. You see it with traffic resuming. I was really happy to hear Mark say that traffic's coming back a bit, foot traffic. I regularly wander through retail areas and malls, and I've noticed that both traffic levels are better week over week as each week passes. So I'm an optimist in terms of that piece of recovery, and I'm hopeful that it helps for restaurants and other hospitality businesses the same way it's worked for retail.
Mark, I want to you start to look at what it's looking as people are now adjusting to phase 2 and hopeful that phase 3. We've also got a transition going on, and maybe you can comment, and Kelowna is not alone. Many local governments are repurposing public space, allowing patios. I'm not sure that's more applicable to restaurants versus retail, or are you getting a sense that both are kind of looking at that option? Because if they are limited to 50% of their capacity within, creating additional space for them is as a reasonable alternative, it sounds like, but it might be a wait and see. Is it applicable for the retail side? You're getting some of your retail members downtown that they might take advantage of that, or is it primarily the hospitality and the restaurants they're looking at?
Yeah, that would be a fair comment. Primarily the restaurants who already have patios. Looking at that, it's it's for the whole city, the patio extension program, and it's also extended to retail. So might use it is probably a great way to describe it right now. The thing is, it's the first time that this kind of thing's been done, so on a long-term basis, like for a couple of months. So what's going to happen is people are going to, some I think are waiting to see what it looks like. They can work here. The great thing is you can work with your neighbor. So if your neighbor's not going to use the sidewalk in front of them, you can work with them to use that portion of the sidewalk in front of their business. The thing is, sometimes there seems to be a misunderstanding that we have business has to do this 7 days a week. Whereas when I'm asked questions about it and they say, well, I don't want to put my clothes out on the sidewalk for 7 days or 6 days in the week, the answer is, well, that's fine. Just do it on Saturday, or just do it on Friday and Saturday, whatever the busy days are. So there's still a little bit of information, and people are kind of feeling their way through it. But ultimately, I think it's going to be a very great option for business downtown, all over the city, to maybe expand their business area. And that addresses exactly what Greg's talking about sanitizers, about the open air that's created when you are able to do business outside as opposed to inside.
And that consumer confidence piece as well. Greg, is that an issue? Local government looks at its levers and abilities to influence this. They're pretty limited, but this is one area because they control land use. Is it, lots of local governments are looking at this, is it something that the Retail Council of Canada has been pushing or supportive of, or hearing from its members? Is that an option, a viable option on the retail side?
I mean, sure, it's an option in the summer, but this being Canada, it's not much of an option in the winter. Right. And so we've encouraged local governments to do it, frankly, with a lot of variety of success. There have been great local governments. Frankly, Kelowna's been excellent on that front. Vancouver, not at all. So you have great differences. But our concern is a longer term concern. COVID-19 is as an issue is not going away in the next 6 months. So what happens after October or so when we are less able to use the sidewalks? And that's our concern on that front. You're going to need some more permanent installations of furniture, umbrellas, and heat lamps if you're going to stay outside in the winter.
Go ahead, Mark. Sorry, go ahead.
I wanted to address the one thing you said. One thing that been working on this week and that just kind of came up, and that's with the patio extensions, which the city has allowed and made the whole process extremely easy for the restaurants and for retail to apply and get it done. And the DKA is providing all of our members with resources on discounting for furniture or 10 by 10 tents and that kind of thing. But when it comes to the extension of the patios, there is no extension in their capacity. So if we're extending by a couple of 100 square feet using area out on the roadway or on the sidewalk, and the capacity before that is, say, 100 people for sake of argument, therefore Dr. Henry's order would say that that restaurant can only have 50 people in it. That's its maximum capacity. Yet they're creating extra square feet, and there's a misunderstanding there, I think, from the liquor licensing people, that The reason we're expanding is so we can make up part of that capacity. So perhaps in this licensing thing, there should be a slight increase in capacity, because if you're going to lose 2 tables on the sidewalk and add 2, then you should be able to fill those tables. And that's a little bit of an issue that we've been working on with local representatives this week.
So you actually have 2 regulatory bodies that are a bit of in conflict, because one created a situation and one has a regulatory that restricts that potentially. So are you working on that then?
That happened before, right?
Right. I mean, that's why there's lots of work, Greg, for you. What are the top issues that you're working on and recommendations to government? Because as you mentioned, this isn't just short term, this is kind of long term as well.
Well, and so, I mean, the big issues have been the rent in the last month or so have been the rent piece and the wage subsidy piece, which we've talked about the wage subsidy piece. We haven't talked about the rent piece. Interestingly, my understanding is that the Attorney General is still tweaking the liquor rules. So I'm, ever hopeful we'll get to the space where we need to be on those fronts. And I know my colleagues in the restaurant sector are working very hard on that front as well. But, the big pieces coming ahead are frankly things that impact labor costs. There was a significant increase in labor costs as a result of the government's actions in the spring. And so labor costs for retail rose very significantly in April, and then the minimum wage went up at the beginning of June. So there have been 2 significant increases, and yet there is no increase in revenue. In fact, there's a decrease in revenue. So we're highly concerned about the ability of retail stores to stay open, and we're worried because government has other measures that are proposed that would have much greater impacts to, in our opinion, to wages. And so those are, that's the look forward pieces. We're looking off at those changes that they proposed that we don't think are sustainable in the current economic environment.
We have a question, and Rob, thanks for that. And by the way, anybody, if you want to use the Q&A function, please do so. If you have any questions to our guests or panelists, Rob has asked, Greg, you made reference to the 25% of normal for retail in March and April. Do you get the statistics for May yet, or is that forthcoming? What are the trend lines you anticipate, or can you crystal ball that?
So May hasn't come out yet. But that actually, so the interesting thing is they only provide us a once a month snapshot glimpse from StatsCan. It's very helpful. I rely on those statistics no end. But what we know from members is actually more helpful in this instance, because we're able to put together a pretty good aggregate that way. And what we know is that in March, the last week was the worst week. It went along and then just the floor fell, unless you were a grocer. That lasted for 2 weeks into April, and then it started to recover. And so right now, probably on aggregate, our feeling is that sales are overall probably about 75% of where they were. That's fine for a sector where you have had the 75% all along, but frankly, it's not very helpful when you lost most of your sales for 2 months. The other problem is that it's an average, and what we know is that there are particular sectors of subsectors of retail, and I'll use luggage as a good example. Those products just aren't selling right now because there is no travel, and so luggage sales will only rebound when there's travel. And so for those businesses, it is going to be exceptionally hard. We've seen actually one other trend. It's covered actually in our Road to Recovery playbook, which is that people have changed their product offerings. I had a good conversation with a retailer in Whistler last week who explained that he has dropped particular lines that he has carried for a long time because the manufacturers were not working with him to help him get a better price so that he could offer a better price to his customers. And I think we're going to see more of that.
Mark, did you have any sense, do you track activity downtown as far as retail? Do you get data in that regard or no?
No, we don't get the data directly from the retailers at all. Our sense is mostly from the traffic that we see downtown and the number of businesses that are reopening. Like Greg was just mentioning about the end of March, you go downtown and it was pretty much, no foot traffic, nobody moving around, stores voluntarily closing, some staying open, trying to figure out what they were doing. But since it actually started to ramp up before phase two started, as more businesses reopened, we did some really great pieces for the businesses that were open, both food and as well as retail. And that was the temporary parking zones so that people could pull in to do their curbside pickup. For the stores that had decided to try an online presence to stay alive, and the ones who did really well at that online thing have actually found that, or hoping that as this business ramps up, as the brick and mortar portion of the business is back in business, that now they've found this additional revenue stream that many hadn't considered before. But we have now a lot of foot traffic. We have businesses opening longer than they were when they first opened. It was maybe Wednesday to Saturday from noon to 6 or 10 to 6. We're seeing them starting to open and staying open on Thursday and Friday nights. So that's basically where our sense is. But we did have a pretty significant number that were open through the whole crisis.
Gentlemen, we have about 10, 15 minutes left as we wrap up. I will give you time as we approach the bottom of the hour just to wrap up and summarize. If you want to make a couple of comments of some takeaways that those that are listening that might be in the retail side that they should think about, or conversely, some of the areas where we could potentially collaborate to encourage government to focus on a particular area to help those businesses, the SMEs and the retail side. And that's, Greg, where I want to just spend a moment. We had some questions in advance provided. One of those, and maybe you started to reference the government programs that are there. The wage subsidy program certainly is helpful. The commercial rental assistance, I'm not sure if it's viewed the same way. I haven't found many that say this is working. And we also, as from a chamber perspective, we have those that are in that business that have property management. And we're also cognizant the Minister of Finance made a decision, at least for 30 days, that there's no evictions. But as temporary measures, maybe that might help, but it still seems that that commercial rent issue, there's not been a good remedy. So what are you hearing? Where is the focus that you're trying to get government in the longer term? Is it around the rent piece or continuance of the wage subsidy program to help these small businesses on the retail side? Where's the primary focus, or are in both of those?
So I think, frankly, the focus is both. There are three sort of major envelopes of government programming. And so one, the rent piece, SECRA, I think we would say, and most business associations would probably say similar things, was badly designed. Frankly, most landlords, commercial landlords I've spoken with, think it's very badly designed. So that was the first piece. I think the provinces, and it's not only British Columbia that introduced a commercial eviction moratorium just for commercial businesses who were eligible for the SECRA program, which is a pretty short term. It's a pretty blunt instrument, frankly. I'm not, and announced a bit late to be really overly effective. It did seem to result in an increase in SECRA applications. So as to fulfill that, that's a good piece. But the other side of it is it's just making people apply for a program that's not really, could use a lot of tweaking. There's also a lot of problems in particularly, here you see something which is different for SECRA in Vancouver than in other municipalities in the province, where you have really high property costs, and most of British Columbia, the property costs are higher than elsewhere. You tend to find more small retail businesses who aren't eligible, and so that's a big problem. But I'm not convinced that that we have found a solution there. And frankly, there's been a lot of good suggestions and not a lot of good pickup by government. They've done better on the wage subsidy piece. Admittedly, CERB does serve as a disincentive for people to work or take on shifts, but they've done better on that. Our concern is that they needed to provide a ramp up, which is to say, you know, as it stands now, if your sales rose above the 30% reduction mark in May, which is certainly possible in British Columbia, where a lot of opening happened in May, then in June you would no longer be eligible for the wage subsidy program. Our concern is that a lot of people will not be eligible for the wage subsidy program. They're talking about building such a ramp for July and August. Our concern is that that will delay the recovery, and so we're disappointed that the federal government's taking a bit too long on that. And frankly, the Minister of Finance seems to be announcing these changes by tweet, which isn't our favorite method of doing this. And the third envelope is the helping banks and the Business Development Bank of Canada make small loans, bridge loans to businesses. The evidence from the banks and from the program is that there hasn't been a lot of pickup on that. So our concern is, since we know how many people are struggling, why that isn't happening. And so that's going to require, frankly, that's something we've been asking our members this week is, did you apply? Why didn't you apply? To better understand that question.
So that's the CEBA?
That is the CEBA, the $40,000 business loan through a bank.
Yeah, it's interesting because we had one of our members saying, well, I'm just a startup, you know, how could I even apply for this? And then realized they had 2 startup loans with high interest rates that they could use this loan to pay off those loans, and this is no interest rate, and then 25% is non-refundable if you pay it back by 2022, correct?
Yeah, and so this is an interesting, and there's the forgivable piece, or the potentially forgivable piece as well. This is an interesting thing, is the government appears not to have done an excellent job on communicating it, and perhaps, frankly, business associations could have done a better job of communicating that benefit. I think one of the things that's a learning for us that's very interesting is, look, we have a lot of members that are large, medium, and small retailers. And so that everybody understands, most retail businesses are in fact small. What we already knew and probably didn't understand the impact in COVID era was that most of those small independent businesses don't get a lot of advice. They don't have the access to the consultancies and what have you that the larger entities have. And so they're not as aware of the programs that are targeted to them. And frankly, when you're just trying to figure out the rules to open your door, you don't spend a lot of time figuring out, should I be applying for that program? You know, I need to get these signs up to open my door to have sales. I need to convince my employees that it's safe to come back to work. Those are the concerns top of mind. So obviously there was an amount of pickup that didn't happen on that program.
Is the Retail Council favorable for a greater investment in that area, or is it just have a position on?
Well, I think we need, we've started to ask our members this. We're favorable to the government doing more to help, and particularly that's because of the property cost issue and the lack of pickup on the property cost piece. We know that that's where people aren't getting a benefit. But we've asked our members this week as to whether or not we can, there's more tinkering that can be done on CEBA in particular.
Yeah, I was on a conversation recently and they talked, we're still in a bit of a Cinderella phase because we've got the wage subsidy there, we've got the emergency benefit program. Sometime down the road and not too distant future, some of this runs out and the full effect starts to take place. That could keep us going probably for another hour, so I'm conscious of our time. And I do want to focus on one particular area and then provide you both a chance to wrap up. we're going to move into phase 3 here. So Greg, the first question to you is around something that we had been promoting here, but didn't appear to get the support of the province. Though the province of Ontario did it, they did regional approaches to where rate of transmission is less. In some regions, you allow greater flexibility in application of rules. I think the opposition in BC proposed that, wasn't received. I don't think the Premier and they're going to move forward with that. So I'm curious if the Retail Council in BC had a position on looking at a regional approach where rate of transmission, it's, you look at northern BC, it's almost non-existent. And even in the interior and the island, different than Metro Vancouver. Conscious of the province has kind of made it clear it's one province. And then the other piece on that, if you could, is when we move to phase 3, those of us in the Okanagan and certainly the Kootenays or in the Peace Country see those consumers in Alberta as big supporters of our economy. And it's not quite clear. And a tourism based is in a good example where those Alberta tourists, they invest here. So is those two issues, does the Retail Council of Canada and BC have a position on?
So we did talk to government in a supportive manner about the regional reopening issue, although they were pretty clear that they didn't have a lot of appetite for that. I think that stemmed actually from Dr. Henry more than the government itself. Truthfully, I mean, you look around at the numbers, the island, the north, and the interior have not had a significant number of new cases, and indeed Richmond hasn't had new cases for quite a while too. So you do have these anomalies even within Metro Vancouver, and most of the spread has been in the Fraser Health region, which is to the east, which is Burnaby and Surrey East. So even in the city and on the North Shore, there's significantly less of a problem right now. We're very optimistic that we're going to phase 3 soon. That's based on Dr. Henry's words and Minister Dix's words. Look, a lot of retail businesses, and it's not just in the Okanagan, even downtown Vancouver, a lot of retail businesses are highly dependent on tourists. There will be no cruise ships. There is not going to be American tourism probably. So we're going to need British Columbians to travel within the province. We'd be favorable to them working out an arrangement with Alberta in terms of a joint bubble. We were very pleased that this happened yesterday in the Atlantic provinces. We think that will speak to a Western bubble as well. My understanding is Alberta seems to be willing to do a joint bubble with BC. There's less willingness from Saskatchewan and Manitoba, who have much lower rates than Alberta, so they look at Alberta a bit nervously. Probably there's some Kootenay communities who do that as well. But, I think that, I'm an optimist on that front, but we're going to be really dependent. Businesses in the Okanagan, in the north, on the island, are going to be very dependent on BC tourists. So, there's nearly 2 million people in Metro Vancouver. It would be very helpful if they all traveled within BC this summer.
Yeah. Mark, some perspectives on that, or are you hearing any? Because you're obviously tied in with the BIAs of British Columbia, right? The provincial association. Is there some discussion in that when we reach the next phase? I'll just make the interesting observation. Where we sit in Kelowna here, it will take us far longer to get to Vancouver Island than to Calgary. Almost twice, because you got to sit and wait for a ferry. So just even the geography, Mark, has there been any discussion from the provincial associations?
No, and I'm on the BIA BC calls that come up, once every 3-4 weeks. That topic has not been brought up. It's been brought up locally. I mean, we've talked about it among the associations here that work together, including yours, Dan, about that coming, and that we welcome Alberta people here because that's going to be part of our recovery. Because I think our recovery is going to be in segments. And, I realize that when October, November comes along, patio extensions aren't going to be that viable. But then again, we got to get there first. And the big part is allowing all these different things to happen. And that includes perhaps getting people from Calgary. You know, I have quite a few friends who come here just for the summer who are from Calgary, Airdrie, and Edmonton. So we hope to see them come back this summer. And, you know, there are people who spend money in our stores. They own, you know, either RVs or boats, and they're on the lake spending money around there. So we want to see them come back, as long as it's safe, of course.
Great. We're getting short on time here, so I want to wrap things up. I want to thank everyone that's joined us. We'll make this recording available. If you have questions afterwards to either of our panelists or to us, please feel free to send us an email. We'll make sure we get that to our panelists. Just an opportunity to wrap up. Any guidance you can give for final, maybe top 3 or even top 2 or top issue that you would suggest those that have joined us here in the retail of some things they need to think about, some good advice as a takeaway. Mark, maybe we'll start with you if that's okay, and just to wrap things up.
Yeah, for our members and, you know, anybody who is on here, the staff of the Downtown Kelowna Association has been mining resources for reopening and different guidelines, and, you know, and they put them all in one place, which is really a great thing. And that's on our downtownkelowna.com. Just go to the resources page, and there's all kinds of documentation that do approach and talk about things about hand sanitizer, physical distancing in the different sectors, as well as a bunch of other information. We also have another document that our Downtown on Call team are out working on, asking if people want assistance, and we've arranged a bunch of different features, discounts, that kind of thing for people who do want to take advantage of extending out onto the sidewalk. And the other thing, only thing I would say is we're there to answer the questions. The staff are working all the time, and just feel free to reach out. We're in the office, and please read the updates we send out once a week. We like to see people, because we put a lot of valuable information in there.
Excellent. Thanks, Mark, for that information and for joining us. Greg, to wrap things up, some final thoughts?
First, as I said right at the start, our Retail Recovery Guide Playbook, downloadable for free, is an excellent guide. It's on our website, retailcouncil.org. So that's an excellent resource. I'm actually more interested in continuing to hear. I think it's important for organizations such as yours and Mark's and mine. We need to hear. We need to hear what the concerns are. I certainly need to hear more about the rent piece and the business assistance piece. I hear it every day from a variety of perspectives, but I need to keep hearing those. You need to keep hearing those, because that'll help us inform government and know what to advocate for.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Greg. You bring up a key point, and I think there's been pretty good evidence of when that communication comes back to the associations, and we've got a few represented here, we're able to pass that on to government. And we have seen where, particularly at the federal level, where programs have been introduced and then adjusted because they're getting that feedback. So it's invaluable that we hear where are the gray areas, where are the challenges, and front and center of that, I think, is a good example is the rent issue, and making a program that is a lot more viable than the one that exists and is tangibly delivering the benefits to those that need it. So keep that communication coming. We'll make sure that your contact information, if it's okay, Greg, available to those that have joined us. We'll post it on our website, and we'll post the links as well. So I want to thank again both of you. Greg Wilson is the Director of Government Relations for the Retail Council of Canada in BC. Greg, we'll look forward to maybe bringing you back. Where are you located, by the way? Are you?
I'm in Vancouver.
Excellent. So that's the one great opportunity with technology. We can bring you in and have a good conversation. And Mark, you're located on your couch at your home, right?
Right now, yeah, I'm on my way to the office shortly, but on Bernard Avenue in downtown Kelowna.
Yeah, and some of us we've kept running here at the chamber, but we're a bit of a hybrid model. Some working from home, some working from home part-time, some working from the office. So there is an adjustment going on, and the best way to face some of those challenges is talk to the people. If you don't have the answer, I can guarantee you the answer is out there. You just got to find the right people, and we're here to help. So thanks, Greg, and thanks, Mark, for joining us this morning. It's been a pleasure to have you here. We will post this on our website. I'm just going to wrap things up by talking about our session that is next week. We're going to focus on our Okanagan School of Business speaker series on particular sectors. The first one we're going to take a deeper dive is tourism. We're pleased to have the President and CEO of Destination BC, Marshall Walden, joining us. Michael J. from Big White going to be talking about what's the winter going to look like. How can we start preparing? We'll look at all those Vancouverites that need to get out of Metro Vancouver. They need to come to the Okanagan and enjoy our wonderful ski hills in the winter and start preparing for that. So Michael would be great to have with us. And Jennifer Horsnell, the Director of Business and Destination Development with Tourism Kelowna. We've got over 100 registered already, so make sure you register in advance. That's next Tuesday at 11 until 12. It's 11 early start for us for our speaker series, our monthly speaker series. So we look forward to having you join us for that. Our next Business Smarts will be a joint venture with Okanagan Young Professionals, OYP. We're talking about a variety of issues around the work environment. We've got Kira Bernston coming back. We had her on talking about WorkSafe BC just before we moved into phase 2. We're going to check and see how things are going so far. And by extension, we're going to have Mark from Pusher Mitchell back as well. We had him earlier talking about some issues around labor law. So some of those might be cropping up. It'll be a great opportunity to talk about that. And then Alexander is going to talk a little bit about some things in remote workers, recruiting, and creating a good work environment, particularly relevant on the retail side, where you want to bring in those employees and make sure that they're comfortable and safe. So it'll be an interesting discussion next week. Just mark in your calendar on June 25th, we'll talk a little bit deeper about managing remote workers. This is more applicable to those that have the larger organizations where their workers can work remotely. Some are just dipping their toes, some are jumping in this full bore. So we'll have a couple of speakers that will help those SMEs that have office workers. How do you manage that workforce more effectively in the longer term? We are holding a number of our events, including our golf tournament. So a plug for our golf tournament was supposed to be in March, then we looked at May, then now we're in September. So you can find information on our website. Want to thank Park Pacific Projects being our title sponsor this year, and our Business Excellence, likely to be an online celebration, but we are planning that nominations will open very shortly. So on behalf of both Greg and Mark and the entire Kelowna Chamber team, thanks for joining us, and we'll talk to you again. Have a great day.